Hey guys, tonight we're stepping through the foggy, gaslit streets of 1890s London for an experience both dazzling and slightly hazardous to your health. What Absinthe actually did to the city's most tragic, eccentric, and occasionally flammable artists. You've heard the rumours, the Green Fairy, painters in berets muttering about colour, and poets raving about inspiration while quietly turning their livers into Swiss cheese. But was Absinthe truly an artistic muse, or just the Victorian version of an energy drink laced with bad decisions? Grab your cravat, loosen your morals, and prepare for a journey into the hazy, bohemian underbelly of history. But before you collapse into your fainting couch, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy this. Seriously, no pressure. And leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. Now, dim those lights, switch on a fan for that faint ghost in the attic ambience, and get comfortable. Maybe wrap yourself in something green, or at least slightly mysterious. If you have a beret, now's your moment. Let's pause for a second. Have you ever wondered what it would feel like to be a struggling artist in Victorian London? Would you have the courage to sip a suspiciously emerald cocktail with strangers who haven't washed since Oscar Wilde's last haircut? Could you handle the existential dread, the poetic arguments, and the very real possibility that your breakfast was also your lunch, and your dinner was just more absinthe? What did they really see? Masterpieces, monsters, or just double vision? Would you survive a single day with artists who thought hygiene was a French conspiracy and believed every bad idea was avant-garde? Did Absinthe truly unlock creativity, or just more unpaid bar tabs? Congratulations! You've just woken up in 1892, in a cramped studio above a fishmonger's shop in Soho. Your hair is wild, your wallet is empty, and someone's already started reciting poetry to the wallpaper. Good luck. It's time for breakfast. Bad idea. Your first meal of the day is not food, but a glass of absinthe, poured with ceremony, dripped over a sugar cube, and stirred until it glows like toxic antifreeze. The taste is herbal, bitter, and slightly medicinal, but the ritual is sacred. Is it magic, madness, or just the only way to start painting before noon? Let's set the scene. You're hunched over a scarred wooden table in your freezing Soho flat. Sunlight slanting through the cracked glass and illuminating a dust cloud that is, somehow, mostly composed of breadcrumbs, paint flecks, and last night's philosophical despair. Your hands are cold, your socks are mismatched, and your muse is nowhere to be found. But you do have absinthe, and in 1890s London, that's about as close as you'll get to breakfast optimism. You take out the bottle, green as envy, and just as dangerous. Victorian absinthe is not a drink so much as a mood, a statement, a health risk. It's rumoured to be part aphrodisiac, part mind expander, and part very creative poison. Some say it can make you see colours that don't exist, and hear music in the silence between gas lamp flickers. Others just say it's cheaper than therapy. First, the ritual. You reach for the absinthe glass, a delicate little goblet that's been washed more in hopes and prayers than actual soap. Place the ornate, slotted absinthe spoon across the rim, balancing a single hard sugar cube, because even Victorian artists knew that a little sweetness is necessary when you're about to ingest herbal rocket fuel. You pour a measure of absinthe over the sugar, watching as it turns the cube into a miniature iceberg doomed to melt in a sea of regret. Then comes the water, poured slowly, drop by drop, from a battered carafe you probably stole from the pub. Each droplet hits the sugar, dissolving it, carrying it into the green liquid below. The glass clouds, swirling and opalescent, like a thunderstorm in a teacup. This is the louche, the magical moment when absinthe turns milky and mysterious. A transformation that artists everywhere swear is the precise instant genius begins. In reality, It's just emulsified essential oils. But you're not here for chemistry. You're here for inspiration. The first sip burns a little, numbs your tongue, and floods your brain with flavors you're not sure you like but are afraid to criticize in case they're listening. The anise hits first, sharp and black licoricey, followed by a strange meadowy bitterness, wormwood, the ingredient that gives absinthe its notorious reputation. Victorian newspapers promise wormwood will drive you mad, grow hair on your eyeballs, or at least inspire you to attempt a sonnet about the wallpaper. Either way, you keep drinking. You sit back, letting the green warmth spread through your chest, and contemplate the beauty of the ritual. In a world where most things are uncertain, rent, food, artistic legacy, whether the landlord has finally given up and moved to Brighton, the absinthe ritual is a rare, predictable pleasure. It's an act of hope disguised as self-destruction. A small ceremony that says, today, we will make something beautiful. Or at least, we'll try. Outside, the city is waking up. Cobblestones echoing with the clatter of carts. The distant call of a newspaper boy who sounds suspiciously like he's making fun of your hat. But inside, you're insulated in your own little emerald bubble. The world is blurry, a bit kinder and full of potential. The edges of your worries soften. The morning anxiety recedes, replaced by an urge to paint, to write, to do something that justifies the sticky rings of absinthe glasses permanently embedded in your desk. Of course, not every artist is as reverent about the process. Some skip the sugar, pour the absinthe straight, and end up talking to the stove by mid-morning. Others debate the perfect water-to-absinthe ratio with the solemnity of a cathedral choir, never once considering whether they've remembered to eat in the last 3 days. Everyone has an opinion, and everyone is convinced their method is the only one that counts. It's the Victorian version of arguing about pour-over coffee, only with more hallucinations and fewer beards. You finish your glass. The world seems lighter, the colours brighter, and your creative block, at least for the moment, melts away. You feel, briefly, that maybe, just maybe, you could make something brilliant today. Or at the very least, you won't remember the embarrassment of your last art show until the hangover sets in. And that's the London absinthe ritual, a performance, a prayer, and a prelude to whatever madness comes next. In the end, it's not about the drink at all. It's about the hope that in the right light, with the right ceremony, even the bitterest mornings can start to taste a little bit sweet. Let's talk about ingredients. Absinthe isn't just any drink. It's wormwood, anise, fennel, and whatever else looked vaguely edible at the chemist's shop. The result? A legal, vaguely narcotic beverage, so powerful it inspired both masterpieces and parliamentary debates about public decency. But who, exactly, unleashed this botanical menace upon the unsuspecting bohemians of London? The answer, like most things in history, is a little bit fuzzy, a little bit French, and comes with a side of wild marketing claims. Absinthe, as a recipe, first appeared in Switzerland in the late 18th century, cooked up by an herbalist named Pierre Ordinaire. Yes, that is his real name, and yes, it does sound like someone who would invent a drink meant to obliterate ordinary consciousness. He prescribed his creation as a medicinal tonic, because in the 1790s, medicine was really just anything you could dissolve in booze and call a cure. His herbal concoction was eventually sold to the Henriot sisters, who, proving once again that women are the backbone of all things chaotic, turned it into a commercial enterprise. Before long, a Frenchman named Major Dubid, who, unlike most majors, wanted to win the war against sobriety, bought the recipe, teamed up with his son-in-law Pernod, and opened the first absinthe distillery in 1797. Fast forward a few decades, and thanks to a combination of aggressive marketing and a French army that apparently could only conquer with a flask in hand, absinthe became the drink of artists, poets, and anyone too stubborn to stick to wine. The name Green Fairy comes not from the hallucinations, but from its otherworldly color. A vibrant, almost radioactive green. This wasn't the subtle shade of healthy vegetables, but more the kind of green you'd expect to find glowing behind a laboratory door marked "Do Not Enter." The color comes from the chlorophyll left in the final product. A happy accident of the herbal infusion. It quickly became a symbol. If you were drinking absinthe, you weren't just thirsty. You were chasing the extraordinary. And yet, somehow, all of this was entirely legal. In fact, in 19th century London, absinthe was considered practically respectable. You could find it at chemists' shops, next to the laudanum and the digestive tonics, because Victorians had never met a poison they couldn't pass off as a cure for nerves. Absinthe was prescribed for everything from toothaches to creative block, to the vague, ever-present malaise known as hysteria. Doctors claimed it improved appetite, cured flatulence, and possibly turned you into Lord Byron if you drank enough. For a while, it was actually recommended to women and children. There were few health and safety guidelines, but plenty of optimism. As for the actual contents, absinthe's infamy comes mainly from one ingredient, wormwood or Artemisia absinthium. This bitter herb contains thujone, a compound that, in large quantities, can allegedly cause convulsions, delirium, and a tendency to argue about metaphysics at 2 a.m. Add to that a hefty dose of anise for the licorice flavor, fennel, and whatever secret botanicals the distiller happened to have in their garden, and you've got a potion tailor-made for questionable decision. And so, London's creative class embraced the green fairy with open arms, open minds, and occasionally open windows to let out the hallucinated bats. It was legal largely because, at first, nobody realized just how much fun people were having with it. The government, never ones to miss a scandal, eventually took notice when the newspapers began reporting on absinthe madness. Cases of artists painting entire canvases with their own hair, poets wandering naked through Hyde Park, and one memorable incident involving a parliamentarian, a taxidermied owl, and a 3-day bender. Still, for a while, absinthe's legal status was its best selling point. Artists could gather in the cafes of Soho and sip it openly, toasting to the muses and cursing the critics. The ritual, the colour, the slight sense of danger, these were all part of the appeal. You weren't just drinking, you were participating in a grand European tradition of ignoring your responsibilities in style. Of course, legality never stopped anyone from making wild claims. Absinthe was blamed for everything from the decline of Victorian morals to the mysterious disappearance of the neighbour's garden gnome. Eventually, pressure from public health officials, angry mothers, and at least 3 major newspapers led to its ban in the early 20th century. But for a brief, brilliant period, the Green Fairy was perfectly, gloriously legal, a fact every artist took advantage of until the last drop, the last painting, and the last questionable sonnet. So next time you hear about the evils of modern designer drinks, just remember, history did it first, and history did it weirder. Your home is a single freezing dash, room filled with half-finished canvases, overflowing ashtrays, and at least 2 mice with bohemian aspirations. The window sticks, the door creaks, and every surface is either covered in paint or sticky with spilled absinthe. You learn to live with the ambience, or at least ignore it. Let's set the scene. You wake up under a pile of coats masquerading as a blanket, shivering as the early London fog seeps through the cracks in your window. The studio is supposed to be a sanctuary for creativity, but in reality, it's more of a test of your immune system. The first thing you see is a broken chair doubling as an easel, balancing a canvas you're convinced will be your masterpiece. If you can ever afford more paint. Your slippers have vanished, likely commandeered by one of the mice. who now seem to be collaborating on a tiny impressionist mural behind the radiator. Every wall is splattered with a combination of oil, watercolor, and existential crisis. Half-painted faces stare at you with disappointment, and one particularly aggressive self-portrait seems to judge you every time you walk past. Your brushes rest in jars of murky water that hasn't been changed since the last Queen's Jubilee, now sporting their own microscopic ecosystems. The air is thick with the scent of turpentine, burnt toast, and unwashed genius. A heady mix that probably counts as a controlled substance in most countries. The floor is another adventure entirely. You have to tiptoe between scattered canvases, empty absinthe bottles, and a constellation of cigarette burns. There's always a new puddle somewhere, maybe rainwater, maybe a failed experiment in performance art, maybe just the ghost of breakfast past. The only thing less certain than the studio's plumbing is the studio's definition of clean. You try not to think about what's growing in the mug you abandoned last week, but sometimes you hear it shift when you walk by. Then there's your furniture. The sofa is a lumpy, ancient settee upholstered in what you suspect is repurposed funeral drapery. It sags in the middle and releases a mysterious puff of dust every time you sit down. A pile of art journals and rejected love letters serves as a makeshift coffee table, and somewhere in the mess lurks your last pair of clean socks, probably hiding from the laundry you swore you'd do in 1889. Heating? If you're lucky, the radiator works long enough to fog up the window before it coughs, groans, and gives up. Otherwise, your main sources of warmth are body heat, day-old tea, and creative rage. In winter, you learn to layer up. 2 shirts, 3 scarves, and a hat that doubles as an impromptu paint rag. Nothing says serious artist like fingerless gloves and a perpetual case of the sniffles. Visitors, because of course your studio is somehow always full of them, bring their own brand of chaos. Fellow artists drop by to borrow supplies, leave cryptic notes, or argue about whether art should mean something or simply look nice above a fireplace. Poets sprawl across the floor, reciting lines about tragic love and leaking candle wax onto your only finished canvas. The neighbor from down the hall appears once a week to demand you stop singing at 3 in the morning, which you do not recall doing, but admit is possible. There are no real boundaries here. The kitchen is a single gas burner perched on a milk crate, with half a loaf of bread turning philosophical by the day. Your diet consists mostly of stale baguettes, questionable cheese, and whatever inspiration you can wring from the last tin of sardines. You once tried to cook a proper meal but set off the fire alarm, which is now just a decorative feature holding up the ceiling. Despite the chaos, the mess, and the faint aroma of artistic decay, this is the heart of your world. It's where you dare to try, to fail, to spill, and to start again. The clutter becomes comforting, a physical record of every midnight brainstorm and every morning regret. It's proof that something is happening here, even if that something is usually just you arguing with a paintbrush and a very judgmental pigeon on the windowsill. By the time evening falls, you're so used to the mess that you barely notice the peeling wallpaper or the symphony of creaks and groans from every corner. The chaos of your studio doesn't stop you from working. It's the whole reason you keep going. It's a disaster, but it's your disaster. And in 1890s London, surrounded by dreams, dust, and dubious life choices, that's exactly enough. Now, about creativity. They say absinthe unlocks the doors of perception. What it actually unlocks is the ability to stare at wallpaper for hours, convinced it's giving you career advice. Was it genius or just gastrointestinal distress? Sometimes it was hard to tell. Absinthe's reputation as a muse is older than your rent arrears. In the bohemian corners of 1890s London, the Green Fairy wasn't just a drink. It was a mystical, slightly alarming shortcut to pure inspiration. You hear rumors. Baudelaire claimed absinthe let him see the poetry of life. Van Gogh, allegedly, painted in a green-tinted haze, until the fairies told him to stop using his own ear as a paintbrush. In Paris, poets whispered that absinthe could help you write a sonnet so devastatingly beautiful it might bring a tear to your tax collector's eye. But London's artists were skeptical, if only because nothing ever worked as advertised in London, including the weather. The myth persists anyway, growing every time an artist forgets how to finish a sentence but remembers how to refill their glass. Absinthe is credited with everything from fueling masterpieces to making you believe the neighbor's cat is critiquing your brushstrokes. The truth, of course, is a little messier. Yes, after a few glasses, you do start to think differently, sometimes profoundly, sometimes in ways that should never be spoken aloud. You write down what feels like the best idea of your life, only to discover the next morning that you've invented the concept of a sandwich, but with soup instead of bread. Revolutionary? Maybe. Marketable? Never. But let's dig into the science, or the lack thereof. Absinthe, at its core, is just high-proof alcohol flavored with enough herbs to put a salad bar out of business. Wormwood, anise, fennel, all designed to impress, and maybe suppress, your sense of self-preservation. The supposed hallucinations are, according to most historians and chemists, mostly the product of drinking an industrial quantity of ethanol on an empty stomach. If you consumed this much brandy, you'd also start believing the wallpaper is in on your secrets. Still, it's hard to resist the romance. There's something deliciously rebellious about believing your next canvas will arrive on a cloud of licorice-scented revelation. You clutch your absinthe, fix your gaze on the flickering candlelight, and wait for the doors of perception to creak open. What you usually get instead is a stomachache, a vague sense of regret, and the distinct feeling that your muse has been replaced by a damp sock. But every now and then, something does shift. A line of poetry appears from nowhere, or you suddenly understand how to use the color green in a way that makes sense to exactly one person on Earth. You, and possibly the landlord's dog. Of course, artists aren't the only ones chasing the myth. London society gossips about absinthe's magical powers, convinced it can turn anyone into a creative genius, or, at the very least, into someone who's very interesting at parties. Meanwhile, doctors warn of absinthism, a terrifying syndrome described as a mix of madness, muscle twitches, and unsolicited advice on color theory. The newspapers run wild. Absinthe drives poets mad. Artists paint through the night on fairy juice. Never mind that most poets were already halfway to madness, and all-night painting sessions were just a matter of not paying your gas bill. There's also a certain solidarity in shared delusion. In the cafes of Soho, you join other artists in the ritual, each convinced that tonight, the green fairy will finally whisper the secret of real art. Instead, someone spills a glass. A debate breaks out over whether purple is a feeling, and you forget what you were supposed to be creating in the first place. The night ends with bold proclamations, blurry sketches, and at least 3 new ideas for paintings you'll never finish. But you all agree, this is what inspiration feels like, even if it smells suspiciously like licorice and broken dreams. The myth, in the end, might be the most important ingredient. Absinthe doesn't have to actually open the doors of perception, it just has to make you believe they're slightly ajar. Because sometimes, the real spark isn't chemical, it's collective. It's the laughter, the midnight arguments, the clink of glasses, and the stubborn hope that genius could be hiding in the next green swirl. So, you raise your glass, toast to inspiration, and ignore the warning signs from your digestive tract. Was it genius? Or just a very dramatic stomachache? Maybe both. And maybe, for one more night, that's enough to keep you painting. Poets, everywhere, they invade your studio, recite verse at ungodly hours, and sometimes weep into their absinthe about lost love, unpaid rent, or the price of onions. Their creative process involves arguing with chairs and using your only towel as a metaphor. You learn quickly that having a poet for a neighbour in 1890s London is a mixed blessing. On the one hand, they can turn your daily misery into a 6-stanza masterpiece. On the other, they have the unique ability to transform breakfast into a dramatic reading of Ode to a Very Cold Egg. The walls of your studio are thin enough that you're intimately familiar with both their romantic disappointments and their digestive issues. Nothing says bohemian community like hearing your neighbour workshopping a sonnet to his landlord at 4 a.m. Let's set the scene. It's 2 in the morning. You're drifting off to sleep, cradling a hot water bottle filled with more hope than actual heat, when you hear a thud from next door. A minute later, a shaky voice recites, "Upon this wretched mattress, life's ambitions slip away." You sigh, pull the pillow over your head, and remind yourself that at least he's not singing this time. The city outside is silent, but your apartment block is alive with the tortured whispers of the artistically inclined. If the muses ever visited, they'd wear earmuffs. Poets travel in packs, multiplying faster than unpaid bills. You host one for dinner, and by midnight you've got 5 sitting on the floor, passing around a bottle of dubious red wine and arguing about whether hope is best described as a flame or a damp sock in November. Your furniture becomes their stage. The armchair is the throne of regret. The bookshelf is a temple of failed ambitions. Your only towel is, tragically, always the banner of lost innocence. It hasn't been dry in weeks. It's not just the verse that keeps you up at night. It's the drama. Every love affair is epic. Every heartbreak, the end of civilization. A simple walk to the grocer's turns into an existential journey worthy of 3 ballads and a tragic epilogue. The object of their affection is inevitably out of reach. A barmaid with scandalously modern hair, a painter who only dates sculptors, or a tax collector with beautiful handwriting. You've heard at least 2 sonnets written for someone who later turned out to be an advertisement for boot polish. And yet, despite the spectacle, you can't help but admire their dedication. Poets treat language the way some people treat family heirlooms, precious, fragile, and likely to cause an argument at the dinner table. They spend hours rearranging 3 words, only to collapse, exhausted, into your laundry pile. The highs are spectacular. When inspiration strikes, the whole room vibrates with possibility. The lows are inevitable. Rejection letters, failed readings, and the discovery that poet is not, in fact, a recognized occupation at the bank. There are good nights, though. Sometimes the conversation sparks. The candles flicker just right, and the absinthe works its strange magic. A poet launches into an improvised epic about lost umbrellas and found hope, and for a few brief minutes, the universe seems to make sense. Someone scribbles on the wall, someone else finds a rhyme for melancholy that doesn't involve broccoli. Even the mice pause their nocturnal art projects to listen. For a moment, the struggles and squalor of bohemian life melt away in a tide of words, laughter, and questionable philosophy. Of course, morning brings reality. The poets scatter like pigeons at a bakery, leaving behind empty bottles, new stains, and a freshly composed poem on the back of your gas bill. You vow, again, to lock the door tonight. You never do. London is cold and unkind, and creative souls need somewhere to warm up. Besides, you suspect you'd miss the chaos if it vanished. After all, every painter needs a poet to remind them that life is more than just brushstrokes and unpaid rent. It's also sleepless nights, overcooked metaphors, and the knowledge that somewhere, Someone cares enough to write a terrible sonnet about your laundry. And so you live. You tolerate. You even begin to love the nightly symphony of nightmares and sonnets next door. It's inconvenient, it's infuriating, it's brilliant in its own unwashed way. And in the morning, when the fog creeps in and the city wakes up to the clatter of hooves and newsboys, you find another poem tucked under your door, a reminder that even in chaos, there's beauty. Or at least, there's something to laugh about over a cup of cold tea and a piece of very questionable toast. Let's set the scene. Newspapers warn that absinthe will melt your brain, cause spontaneous dancing, or transform you into a Frenchman. Politicians panic. Clergymen clutch their pearls. And artists respond by drinking twice as much, just to prove a point. It's 1883, and London is teetering on the edge of what can only be described as a moral meltdown, painted a vivid shade of green. One day, absinthe is the bohemian's breakfast and the poet's preferred lunch. The next, it's public enemy number one. The Daily Telegraph runs a front-page story. Artist found conversing with umbrella. Blames the green fairy. Soon, rumours swirl that absinthe will not only unhinge your mind, but will cause you to develop a sudden, inexplicable craving for garlic and a penchant for existential philosophy. The panic spreads like poorly distilled gin at a painter's convention. The city's politicians, desperate to be seen doing something, propose wild new laws. Should absinthe be taxed, banned, or simply forced to wear a warning label reading, "May cause poetry"? Members of Parliament are spotted arguing in smoky back rooms, some quietly sipping the contraband themselves and insisting it's purely medicinal. At the same time, temperance leagues organise marches through Soho, carrying banners emblazoned with slogans like "Keep London Green," with envy, not absinthe, and "Say no to Frenchification." Clergymen give thunderous sermons denouncing the green fairy. Church bulletins declare that absinthe is the devil's elixir, responsible for everything from marital discord to suspicious facial hair. One especially dramatic vicar in Hampstead claims that absinthe drinkers will dance themselves straight to perdition, which, in some circles, is considered a reasonable alternative to working in an office. Meanwhile, the medical establishment is hopelessly divided. Some doctors warn of absinthism, a terrifying condition described as a mix of hallucinations, muscle spasms, and spontaneous interpretive dance. Others, less alarmed, quietly point out that any beverage with this much alcohol will make you see fairies, regardless of wormwood content. The debate is so heated that a well-known surgeon ends up challenging a Home Office official to a duel, using baguettes as swords and onions as seconds. But for the city's artists, all this moral panic is just fuel for the fire. Painters, poets, and musicians embrace their new role as society's favourite scapegoats. You join the others in a crowded cafe, raise a glass of luminous green, and toast to corruption, creativity, and the inevitable collapse of social order. Someone scribbles a cartoon of a green fairy riding a double-decker bus. Another starts a rumour that absinthe makes you immune to criticism, which is patently untrue but very comforting on exhibition night. Naturally, the panic only makes absinthe more popular. If you want to be a real artist, you drink it defiantly, in public, and preferably with a dramatic flourish. The bars are packed, the air thick with smoke and rebellious laughter. Musicians compose sonatas in honour of La Fée Verte, and critics are left to wonder whether they're witnessing a renaissance or the end of civilization as they know it. Even the landlords get in on the act, raising the rent for anyone caught with a suspiciously green bottle. Hazard pay, they call it. As the weeks pass, the stories grow wilder. Absinthe is blamed for everything. The fog, the rats, the latest scandal in Parliament, and, most tragically, the rise in surrealist poetry. Parents warn their children that the green fairy will carry them off to Paris, which sounds thrilling until you realize it's just code for running away to join a traveling mime troupe. Eventually, official action arrives. City councils debate, commissions are formed, and stern men in top hats argue about public decency while surreptitiously checking their watches for absinthe o'clock. But the Bay and Dot green fairy is stubborn. Even as restrictions tighten, artists hold underground tastings, complete with secret passwords and coded invitations. Bring something green, preferably not a vegetable. Through it all, London's creative class stays unfazed. After all, if you're going to be blamed for society's collapse, you might as well enjoy the perks. You toast your friends, embrace your inner Frenchman, and promise to write a scathing poem about it all. Assuming you can still remember your own name in the morning, the panic will fade. But the stories, the rebellion, and the green stains on the carpet, those are here to stay. It's time for self-reflection. You try to paint your own portrait, but the eyes keep coming out sideways, and your muse is just a mouldy baguette on the table. You call it avant-garde and move on. That's the thing about being a London artist in the age of absinthe. You're never quite sure where inspiration ends and delusion begins. The city outside is all sharp lines, chimneys and rooftops, and the endless geometry of gaslit streets, but inside, everything blurs. Your hand, which used to be steady, now shakes just enough to make every brushstroke a gamble. You stare at the canvas, then at your reflection in a cracked mirror propped up on a stack of overdue bills. Do you really look that pale, or has the absinthe turned your skin slightly chartreuse? It's probably both. This portrait is supposed to be honest. That's what all the critics and self-help pamphlets say. The artist's job is to capture the truth. But truth in 1890s London is slippery, especially after 2 glasses of the green fairy and an evening spent debating whether the human soul is more egg-shaped or more like a badly boiled potato. You try to capture your essence, the wild hair, the haunted eyes, the faint whiff of licorice that clings to everything you own. But mostly, you just end up with a face that looks like it's halfway through a nervous breakdown and a background that's less moody and more accident at the lettuce stand. The great masters, Rembrandt, Velázquez, all those clever Dutchmen with excellent pensions, made self-portraits look easy. But they didn't have to contend with a studio that smells like wet socks and existential dread, or a mouse that keeps trying to chew the edge of your palette. Every time you look up, your muse, the baguette, now evolving its own ecosystem, seems to have shifted positions. Did it move? Or are you just seeing things again? Hard to say. You dip your brush in absinthe instead of water by mistake, and the green tint actually helps. You make a note to write about accidental genius in your memoirs. Of course, the real challenge isn't the technique. It's the existential horror of staring at yourself for hours on end. You catch your own gaze and wonder, who is this person? Why is their left eyebrow so much higher than the right? Are those worry lines? Or just a smudge? Is that a look of creative intensity? Or have you simply forgotten how to blink? This is the sort of introspection absinthe is famous for inspiring. Equal parts revelation and creeping dread. You resolve to paint yourself as you really are. Flawed, frazzled, slightly green, but determined. Or at least, determined enough to make it to lunchtime. As you work, you can't help but narrate the process in your head. Part artist, part unreliable biographer. Here we see the artist in his natural habitat, surrounded by chaos, fueled by questionable beverages, and haunted by the ghost of missed deadlines. The neighbours probably think you're eccentric, but it's London in the 1890s. Eccentricity is practically a requirement. You try adding a hat to the portrait, then remove it, You give yourself a mysterious smile, then scrub it out and start again. The only thing that stays the same is the faint green glow around your outline, a little halo of absinthe-induced creativity. Or possibly just poor ventilation. Hours pass, the daylight shifts. Outside, you hear the clatter of a delivery cart, the distant shouting of a newsboy, and the low, constant hum of city life. Inside, you finally step back and take in your creation. It's odd. It's a little sad. It's definitely not going to win any prizes at the Royal Academy. But it's real, or at least real enough for tonight. In the end, you sign your name with a flourish that's half pride, half please don't judge me. This is the portrait of an artist, tired, tipsy, hopeful, and a little bit green. In another century, maybe some art historian will call it early modernist. For now, you just call it done, and pour yourself another glass. It's evening. You stumble through Soho to a cafe where the walls sweat and the clientele are part-time philosophers, full-time tax evaders. The coffee is terrible, but the absinthe flows. Conversation ranges from the meaning of art to whether anyone has seen your shoes. The bohemian nightlife of 1890s London is not for the faint of heart, nor for anyone with an aversion to sticky tabletops or strangers reciting verse in the corner. The cafes of Soho are a world unto themselves, part sanctuary, part circus, and all held together by a film of spilled drink and the collective willpower of people who should probably be asleep. The moment you walk in, you're enveloped by the heavy perfume of damp coats, burnt sugar, and enough pipe smoke to make you wonder if there's a small industrial revolution happening beneath the floorboards. You squeeze past a painter locked in a staring contest with his own reflection in a soup spoon. The tables are crowded with mismatched chairs, candle stubs, and enough half-finished sketches to wallpaper the entire city. On your left, two poets debate whether rhyme is a bourgeois affectation or a tool of the oppressed. On your right, a cabaret singer in a feathered hat is drinking directly from the absinthe bottle and serenading her empty tip jar. There's a small dog under your table. He doesn't belong to anyone. He is, however, wearing a scarf. At the bar, a man with an accent that shifts every 10 minutes offers you coffee that tastes suspiciously like disappointment. It arrives in a chipped mug, black as night, and nearly as bitter as your latest rejection letter from the Royal Academy. You choke it down anyway, because hydration is important and the alternative is drinking the questionable tap water. Fortunately, you're not here for the coffee. You're here for the company and, if you're lucky, a free round of whatever's glowing green behind the bar. Absinthe is the real currency here. Glasses are passed from hand to hand, each one accompanied by an earnest discussion about technique. Do you drip the water over the sugar, or just dunk it and hope for the best? No one seems to know, but everyone pretends to be an expert. Someone claims that the true secret is French patience, but the last Frenchman who drank here disappeared after a run-in with the house cat. Soon, the debates grow louder. Should art shock or soothe? Is it better to starve for your work or sell out for a hot meal? Did someone really see Oscar Wilde in here last week? Or was that just Reginald in a cravat and a mood? You nod along, only half listening, mostly searching the room for your missing shoes, which it turns out are being worn as a hat by a poet named Violet. Every so often the mood shifts and someone will stand up to recite. Maybe it's a sonnet about London fog, or a political diatribe disguised as a limerick. Sometimes, if the cafe owner is distracted, an impromptu cabaret show erupts. A piano appears from nowhere, a soprano wails about love and unpaid rent, and the audience applauds, half in genuine appreciation and half because it's an excuse to stand up and stretch legs gone numb from hours of philosophizing. There are fights too. Some are intellectual, heated debates about the value of realism versus the abstract, or whether a true artist can ever be happy. Some are more practical, arguments over whose turn it is to pay the tab, or who started the rumor about the landlord's borrowed umbrella collection. Most conflicts are resolved with another round of drinks, a handshake, or an agreement to collaborate on a new art movement with a name that nobody will remember in the morning. You linger until closing, the hours slipping by in a blur of laughter, argument, and the soft clink of glasses. Eventually, you find yourself out on the cobbled street, lighter of pocket, heavier of heart, and absolutely certain that you have made great strides in the pursuit of art, or at least in the pursuit of interesting stories to tell later. The cafe's glow fades behind you as you make your way home, uncertain whether you've found inspiration, indigestion, or simply a new appreciation for terrible coffee. One thing's for sure, you'll be back tomorrow, in a city that so often feels grey and indifferent. These strange, sticky, exuberant little meeting spots are where life is lived most loudly, where genius and foolishness share a table, and where, just for an evening, the world makes a weird and wonderful kind of sense. Let's talk about inspiration. Is your muse a beautiful stranger, a ghostly vision, or just the green fairy herself? Some nights she's all three, especially after your third glass. It's one of those London nights when the rain drums out a rhythm against your window, and your only company is the dim glow of a candle, the endless murmur of the city, and the swirling green in your glass. You stare at a blank canvas or a half-filled notebook, waiting for something, someone, to spark an idea, and then there she is, the muse, or rather, a parade of muses, each more ambiguous than the last. Sometimes, the muse arrives as a memory, a mysterious figure glimpsed in a crowded cafe, or a flash of laughter from a stranger on the street. She hovers, at the edge of your vision, elusive, slightly out of focus, always slipping away when you try to sketch her features. You chase her through your thoughts like a detective in a foggy alleyway, half convinced she's real, half aware she might be the product of last night's questionable cheese. Other times, your muse is a ghost, ethereal, pale, and far too interested in your unfinished manuscript. She'll perch on the arm of your chair, whispering advice that's either profound or pure nonsense. Paint with your elbows, not your hands. She leaves notes on your desk in handwriting suspiciously like your own, signed only with a lipstick kiss or a smudge of licorice-scented green. But let's be honest, more often than not, your muse is Absinthe herself. After a few glasses, inspiration is a collaborative process between your subconscious, your stomach, and a vague green blur that might be a fairy or might be a speck on your spectacles. You begin to think in metaphors and daydreams. Your ideas become bold, even reckless. You decide your next poem will be a tribute to umbrella handles, or that your next painting will feature 7 noses. Because why not? The Green Fairy encourages you to be brave, to trust your weirdest instincts, and to ignore any critics who haven't yet tasted true artistic delirium. Of course, your muse has a mischievous side. She's as likely to push you into disaster as into brilliance. Some nights, she inspires you to write until dawn, convinced you've finally produced your magnum opus. The next morning, you discover you've filled a dozen pages with nothing but lists of vegetables and the word fog scrawled in different directions. Is this genius, or just a warning from your digestive system? You may never know. And then there are nights when the muse is a living, breathing person, a fellow artist, a poet, a lover, or a friend. She bursts through your studio door, trailing inspiration, laughter, and the faint scent of rain-soaked wool. Together, you debate the meaning of art, dance barefoot to the sound of your neighbor's piano, and pledge to change the world, one terribly rhymed couplet at a time. The muse becomes a collaborator, a rival, a source of encouragement, and, sometimes, a reason to get out of bed on a grey London morning. But the most confusing aspect of the muse, sometimes she's just a side effect. Absinthe or no absinthe, there are moments when inspiration bubbles up not from mystical visions or haunting beauty, but from pure exhaustion, hunger, or boredom. You find yourself writing love letters to your umbrella, or sketching portraits of your laundry because it's the only thing in the room that will sit still. Creativity doesn't always look like fireworks. Sometimes it looks like delirium, or like the desperate attempt to make meaning out of the ordinary and absurd. In the end, you stop worrying about whether your muse is real, imaginary, or simply the result of questionable life choices. You learn to welcome her in whatever form she takes, as a ghost, a friend, a flash of colour in the fog, or a green fairy whispering "why not" in your ear. Because in the 1890s, in a city that thrives on eccentricity and invention, it doesn't really matter where inspiration comes from, only that you keep following it, one lopsided poem or slightly green-tinted painting at a time. Competition is fierce. Your neighbour, a painter with more depth than talent, claims absinthe is his secret weapon. You suspect it's just malnutrition with a stylish name. Who will sell their work first? Spoiler: it's never you. Welcome to the cutthroat world of the London art scene, where every freezing garret hides at least two artists. One convinced they're the next Monet, the other hoping to eat something more nutritious than toast this month. Absinthe, naturally, is at the heart of every rivalry. Some see it as the secret ingredient in every great painting. Others see it as the only thing separating them from a complete breakdown, or maybe both. Either way, the race is on. Who can be the first to achieve fame, fortune, or failing that, a free meal? Let's meet the competition. Across the hall is Rupert, who has developed an impressive ability to simultaneously borrow paint, steal your breakfast, and humble brag about his impressionist phase. He claims absinthe has expanded his mind, unlocked new dimensions of colour, and possibly given him the power to see through walls. You're pretty sure he's just staring at the cracks in the plaster and hoping they form a portrait of Queen Victoria. Rupert's studio is a monument to chaos. Empty bottles double as brush holders, and the air is thick with the scent of turpentine, stale bread, and delusion. His paintings feature wild swirls of green and yellow, and every face has the haunted look of someone who's just realized their rent is 3 months overdue. He insists he's living the Parisian lifestyle, which, in London, mostly means layering scarves and hoping no one notices you've worn the same socks for a week. You, on the other hand, try to take a more methodical approach. You spend hours planning each canvas, sketching, erasing, and starting over. You ration your paint, your money, and your enthusiasm. Every so often, you peek out your window and see Rupert furiously painting by candlelight, surrounded by admirers, well, 2 poets and a cat. But in Soho, that counts as a crowd. He tells everyone absinthe is the key to his creativity, pouring it with dramatic flair and quoting Baudelaire until someone coughs up enough change for the next round. The rivalry gets personal. You both enter the same local exhibition, a converted bakery with more mice than visitors. The judges look bored, the walls are damp, and the prize is a basket of slightly bruised apples. But still, the tension is palpable. Rupert unveils a painting he swears was inspired by an absinthe-fueled vision of the Thames, but looks suspiciously like a water stain with ideas above its station. You show your carefully crafted portrait, only to hear a critic whisper, "Interesting, so normal." In the bohemian world, normal is a curse. You wonder if you should have added a few extra noses, or maybe painted it upside down. As the weeks go by, you both slide deeper into the absurdities of artistic rivalry. Rupert throws absinthe parties, invite only, unless you bring bread. You counter by offering serious discussions on light and form, which nobody attends except Violet the poet, who's just here for the heating. The debates grow heated. Is absinthe a muse or an excuse? Does hunger sharpen your artistic edge or just make you more irritable at group critiques? Outside, London marches on, indifferent to your creative crisis. The galleries favour established names. The critics prefer the mysterious and strange. Rupert starts a rumour that he's been commissioned by a mysterious Parisian collector. You see through it immediately, since the only thing he's been commissioned to do lately is help the landlord carry buckets up from the leaky basement. Still, you can't help but envy his swagger, his willingness to fail gloriously, his complete lack of concern for nutritional guidelines. In the end, no one sells a painting. The only thing exchanged is a half-eaten onion and some grandiose promises for next week's show. But the rivalry keeps you both going, pushing you to try harder, dream bigger, and occasionally to share a laugh over a glass of absinthe when all else fails. Maybe the real secret isn't the drink at all, it's the stubbornness, the camaraderie, and the knowledge that somewhere in this city someone else is struggling just as absurdly as you are. And so, you raise a glass to artistic competition. The best excuse in the world for painting badly, eating worse, and staying up far too late, chasing a dream as green and elusive as the fairy in your cup. It's midnight. Someone in the cafe is arguing that absinthe is a shortcut to genius. Someone else is trying to climb inside a piano. Both have a point. This is what passes for a philosophical symposium in 1890s Soho. A dim room packed with artists, writers, musicians, and the occasional confused accountant, all warmed by the twin fires of creative ambition and strong drink. The conversation, if you can call it that, ranges wildly, from the merits of Impressionism to whether anyone in the room remembers where they left their umbrella. At the centre of it all is the bubbling debate that animates every bohemian haunt from Paris to Piccadilly. Does absinthe unleash the genius lurking in your soul, or does it simply make you better at embarrassing yourself in public? Tonight, the self-proclaimed genius table is especially rowdy. On one end, a painter with wild hair and wild theories declares that the green fairy dissolves the walls of convention and invites the cosmic dance of pure creativity. He has, unfortunately, painted the same canvas 12 times in a row and just discovered he can rhyme existential with confessional. On the other end, a poet, barefoot and slightly blue around the edges, insists that madness is a precondition for greatness. You must first lose your mind, he proclaims, before you can paint what only the mad can see. A third participant is working on a proof that true art can only be made by people who've eaten nothing but bread crusts for 3 weeks. But she's distracted by trying to coax a stray cat into joining the debate. The rest of the cafe is divided. Some claim that absinthe unlocks the gates to the subconscious. Others say it just unlocks the door to the alley out back, where you'll soon find yourself hunched over, reconsidering your last 5 life decisions. Either way, you're surrounded by people who believe, truly, deeply, and possibly delusionally, that a little madness is the key to art, and that suffering for your craft is a perfectly reasonable explanation for the missing rent. As the absinthe flows, the debate turns practical. Is genius the result of discipline, study, and hours at the easel? Or is it a gift bestowed by wild nights and wilder spirits? Can a sober mind ever create work that shakes the world? Or does the act of blurring your senses with wormwood and poetry make you brave enough to try the impossible? There's no consensus. A pianist interjects, insisting that absinthe helps him hear music in the spaces between the notes. No one points out that he's currently wedged head first inside the piano, looking for the lost chord. All around, evidence for both sides abounds. On one wall hangs a painting so vivid it seems to vibrate. Was it made in a fever of inspiration, or just a fit of digestive rebellion? On another table, someone is composing a sonnet so heartbreakingly sincere that everyone agrees to cry into their sleeves, just for atmosphere. Yet, for every moment of possible genius, there's an equal measure of chaos. Spilled drinks, ruined sketches, and a heated discussion about whether pigeons are the true artists of the city, since they leave installations everywhere. By 2 a.m., the argument has reached its natural conclusion. Everyone agrees to disagree. Or rather, everyone is too distracted by hunger, exhaustion, or the haunting sound of the piano keys being played from the inside. You walk home through the quiet streets, still turning over the question in your mind. Genius or madness? Maybe, in the end, the distinction is overrated. After all, history is filled with artists who straddled the line between brilliance and disaster. Some of them left behind masterpieces, others just left behind a very confusing shopping list. In 1890s London, with its damp air and endless hunger for the new, perhaps it's better not to know which side you're on. Maybe what matters isn't whether absinthe makes you a genius or a fool, but that it gives you the courage to try again and again, regardless of how many times you land inside a piano. So, the debate rages on. Is it genius or is it madness? Maybe it's both. Or maybe, after enough absinthe, they're just two sides of the same green-stained coin. Either way, it makes for a memorable night, a few wild stories, and, with luck, a masterpiece that only makes sense if you squint. Your hands shake, your vision blurs, the wallpaper moves. Congratulations, you're experiencing the full 1890s artist's wellness routine. The medical experts call it absinthism. You call it Tuesday. Let's be honest, you were warned. Every cafe roomer, every disapproving landlady, every doctor who still prescribes leeches has whispered about the notorious effects of absinthe. It's not just strong, they say. It's peculiar. But you, like every great London artist, decide the risk is worth it. After all, how bad could it be? You've survived cheap gin, damp socks, and poetry night at Violet's flat. This is just another flavour of suffering for your art. At first, it's subtle, a pleasant warmth, a certain poetic wobble in your step, the sense that you're being gently spun in a circle by invisible hands. The next stage is less poetic and more existential. Your hands begin to tremble. A problem when your life's ambition involves painting fine details or keeping tea in the cup and not in your lap. The shaking is so common that artists develop coping techniques, like bracing elbows on the table, double-fisting teacups, or simply working in the impressionist style and blaming the blurs on artistic vision. Your eyes, meanwhile, play tricks on you. The room acquires a faint, greenish haze, like you're peering at the world through a celery stalk. Shadows flicker at the edges of your vision. The gaslights seem to hum, and if you stare at the wallpaper long enough, it starts suggesting career changes. You try not to panic when your own reflection winks at you from a puddle of absinthe on the floor. You know it's just the drink. Probably. Then come the truly charming symptoms. Waves of nausea, an ache behind the eyes, and the infamous green hour, when time slows, words slip from memory, and you spend 5 minutes trying to recall your own address. Some say absinthe causes hallucinations. Others argue it simply reveals truths too weird to be seen in daylight. Either way, it's difficult to distinguish between a true vision and the after effects of eating nothing but day-old bread and cheese that's gone from blue to philosophically complex. Doctors have a word for all this: absinthism. Victorian medical journals describe it with a flourish, a syndrome of tremors, hallucinations, epileptiform fits, and a fatal decline of morals and manners. If you're a struggling artist, that just sounds like Monday through Thursday. The newspapers, naturally, make it sound even worse. Tales abound of painters driven to madness, poets collapsing mid-recital, and one infamous critic who tried to review a cactus for the Sunday edition. The more the papers warn about the dangers, the more the artists drink. If you're going to be doomed, you may as well be legendary. Still, not all symptoms are created equal. Some artists claim absinthe makes them more creative, more alive, more attuned to the swirling energies of the city. Others just become more convinced that the neighbor's cat is plotting against them. Sometimes, it's hard to tell where the absinthe ends and your own peculiarities begin. Your friends assure you that everyone feels this way, right up until they start licking the wallpaper or reciting Hamlet at a coat rack. The hangover, when it comes, is legendary. The sun hits your face with the subtlety of a police raid. Your head pounds, your mouth tastes like regret, and the memory of last night arrives in scattered flashes, arguing about metaphysics with a chair, promising to revolutionize the art world with a painting of pure sound, mistaking a green lamp for Oscar Wilde. Breakfast is a dry crust and strong tea, both of which you drop when your hands begin to shake again. Still, for all the dire warnings, you and your fellow artists keep coming back. The side effects have become badges of honor, proof that you're living on the edge, chasing the green muse into strange and uncharted territory. The world might call it a syndrome, you call it part of the process. And who knows? Maybe tonight's blurriness will become tomorrow's masterpiece. Or at the very least, another excellent story for the next midnight debate at the cafe. So, your hands shake, your vision blurs, and the wallpaper occasionally winks. But you wouldn't trade it. Not for a safe, sober life. Not for all the tea in London. In the end, these side effects aren't just hazards of the job. They're evidence that, for better or worse, you are exactly what you always hoped to be. An artist, a dreamer, and a survivor of another spectacularly weird Tuesday. Romance flourishes among the creative class, if you count cryptic notes, nervous giggles, and the occasional duel at dawn. Absinthe-fueled passion is as volatile as the drink itself, and the heartbreaks come with hangovers. Love in 1890s London is complicated at the best of times. But toss in a few glasses of absinthe, and the bohemian dating scene takes on an extra layer of chaos. By candlelight in smoke-filled cafes, artists and poets fall in love at least twice an evening, usually with the same person, and sometimes even with their own reflection in the window. The boundaries between genuine emotion, artistic admiration, and enthusiastic misreading of a metaphor get blurrier as the night goes on, and as the absinthe flows. Let's set the stage. You're leaning across a sticky table, scribbling lines of poetry onto a napkin, eyes locked with someone whose hat is almost as dramatic as their laugh. Every sentence becomes a declaration. Every offhand comment a coded message. You, quote, Baudelaire and blush when your muse, or rival, quotes him back. Your hands touch as you both reach for the same glass. Is it love, or just a desperate attempt to steady yourselves? Of course, no romance among the creative set would be complete without letters. Dozens of them, written in sprawling script, tucked into empty paint tins or slid under doors in the dead of night. The love letter is a staple, but with artists, even love is a performance. Sometimes you receive a note so dense with metaphor that you're not sure if you're being wooed or challenged to a duel. You respond in kind, perhaps adding a pressed flower, or a lock of hair, or in one memorable instance, half a biscuit. Absinthe is never far away. More than a few letters arrive with a green ring in the corner, or a faint scent of licorice. proof that creativity and intoxication travel hand in hand. Jealousy is as much a part of the scene as paint stains and unpaid debts. Flirtation is practically a group activity. And it's not unusual to find yourself in a heated argument over whether Violet, the poet, is truly in love with your friend, or just in love with his latest metaphor about rain-soaked cobblestones. Duels, mercifully, are rare, and usually end with someone dramatically throwing their hat in the canal rather than any actual violence. But the emotional stakes are high, and nothing says commitment like arguing over the meaning of a smile at 2 a.m. while the landlord pounds on the wall. Heartbreak, naturally, follows close behind, when an artist's romance falls apart. The whole neighborhood knows. Tears are shed over late-night coffee. Tragic verses are declaimed from windowsills, and the cafes fill with gloomy faces and louder than usual arguments about the purpose of love. Everyone claims heartbreak is good for creativity, though it's less good for your liver and even worse for your rent payments. At least you get a new sonnet out of the ordeal, and maybe a painting of a wilting daffodil that critics later describe as sublimely dismal. Still, amid the melodrama, there are moments of real sweetness. 2 lovers, curled together on a sagging sofa, reading lines from Keats and giggling at the scratchy noises from the mice under the floorboards. A midnight walk through the foggy streets, holding hands and making impossible promises. A secret picnic in the park, consisting of stale bread, a questionable apple, and a bottle of absinthe shared under a gas lamp that flickers like your future prospects. For all the heartbreaks and green-stained love letters, the pursuit of romance remains stubbornly hopeful. Maybe it's the belief that passion, even when it's messy and inconvenient, is better than loneliness. Maybe it's the stubborn optimism that somewhere in this city, there's someone whose poetry is even worse than yours. Or maybe it's just the absinthe whispering that tonight, anything is possible. Especially if you write it down and deliver it in the morning with a single wildflower and a half apology. So the cycle repeats. Fall in love, write a poem, share a drink, break a heart, and start again. In the end, every heartbreak becomes part of your art, every letter a testament to hope. And somewhere in the middle of all the nonsense, maybe, just maybe, you stumble into something real. A love story scribbled in green ink that survives even the wildest hangover. Your social circle expands to include writers, painters, and the occasional person who claims to be Oscar Wilde's lost cousin. You swap stories, share sips, and hope some of their fame will rub off on you, preferably before your liver gives out. There's something magnetic about London's art scene in the 1890s. Soho's cafes and smoke-filled parlours are the great equaliser, where penniless painters, sharp-tongued poets, and half-mad musicians rub elbows with people you've only ever seen sketched in the society pages. Here, reputation is currency, and a good anecdote is worth more than a week's rent. You soon discover that the right circle of friends is part lifeline, part lottery ticket, and part extended exercise in collective denial. It's not unusual to find yourself 3 seats down from James McNeill Whistler, whose wit is sharper than his tailoring, and whose lawsuits are as legendary as his nocturnes. He's more than happy to explain, in excruciating detail, why art critics should be banished to a small island in the Thames, preferably without umbrellas. If you listen closely, you might catch him dropping casual barbs at the expense of John Ruskin, or reminiscing about the time he painted an entire wall the wrong shade of blue, purely out of spite. You nod, smile, and make mental notes. After all, you never know when the ability to name-drop will come in handy at the next exhibition. And then there's Oscar Wilde, or at least people who orbit Wilde's universe with the intensity of moths around a street lamp. Sometimes he appears in person, flamboyant and devastatingly witty, drawing crowds like a magnet. Other times it's just his entourage, critics, actors, poets, and one mysterious fellow who swears he was Wilde's roommate at Oxford, despite being at least 20 years too young. The Wildean set takes over a corner of the cafe, holding forth on beauty, tragedy, and whether hats are a statement or a symptom. The arguments are so dazzlingly clever you forget, for a moment, that you're still wearing a scarf you found in a lost and found bin. Being part of this social scene is its own kind of performance. You rehearse your stories, polish your best punchlines, and practice looking both bored and fascinating at the same time. It's a game. Everyone wants to be known. Nobody wants to look like they're trying. If someone tells you their latest painting was inspired by a momentary sadness, 3 pigeons, and a particularly sarcastic lamplighter, you nod and pretend you understand. After all, last week you explained your own latest work as an exploration of melancholy in 7 shades of beige. No one questioned it. You're never far from gossip. News of scandal travels faster than actual news. 1 minute, Whistler is at the bar, holding court about tonal harmony. The next, rumours circulate that he's moving to Paris to avoid a particularly stubborn creditor. Someone else claims to have seen Wilde leaving a cabaret at dawn, surrounded by adoring fans and at least 2 confused horses. These stories grow wilder in the retelling. By morning, it's said the horses were reciting poetry, and the cabaret singer was none other than Sarah Bernhardt in disguise. In this crowd, it's not enough to merely exist. You have to be memorable. Artists vie to be the most eccentric, the most clever, the most outrageously dressed. Whistler perfects his monocle and cape ensemble. Wilde alternates between peacock feathers and velvet jackets. The rest of you do your best with second-hand waistcoats, mismatched gloves, and the occasional accidental trend-setting, like Rupert's infamous trousers as scarf phase, which lasted exactly 1 night and 3 unfortunate sketches. The cult of cool is exhausting but exhilarating. You feel yourself swept up in the current of conversation, artistry, and rivalry. Maybe you haven't sold a painting in months, but you've traded witticisms with Wilde, spilled absinthe on Whistler's cuff, and debated the meaning of beauty with a woman who swears she's descended from Byron's favourite cook. For a brief, brilliant moment, you almost believe that fame is contagious and that your next canvas will be the one that finally gets you noticed, if not for your art, then at least for your increasingly creative fashion choices. And if fame never comes, at least you'll have the stories and a few green-stained memories to keep you warm on cold, uncertain nights in Soho. Let's talk about money. There isn't any. Rent is overdue. Your boots have holes, and your best painting just sold for enough to buy a single onion. Absinthe is both the consolation and the cause of your financial ruin. It's one of the great ironies of artistic life in 1890s London. Genius is everywhere, but money is not. If you're a painter, poet, or aspiring composer, your pockets are likely as empty as your landlord's promises to fix the heating. You've learned to stretch a coin further than the laws of physics would suggest possible. Your last commission paid in exposure. Your lunch, borrowed bread from a friend who's equally broke but slightly less hungry. Every night you count your pennies, and every morning you discover someone's spent them. Usually you. Usually on absinthe. Let's set the daily scene. You wake up to the pleasant sound of creditors knocking on your door, and the less pleasant realization that your wallet contains exactly 1 train ticket, 2 buttons, and an IOU from Rupert. You make your way to the market, hoping to barter a sketch for a stale bun. Sometimes you succeed, sometimes you're met with a sympathetic shrug and a try the charity soup. You return to your studio, pockets no heavier, stomach no fuller, and dreams only slightly diminished. Some days, you are flush with hope. You've finished a painting, your best yet, you think, It captures all the agony and ecstasy of the bohemian struggle. A single candle flickering in the darkness, or perhaps a portrait of Violet gazing dramatically into the void, or at the laundry, you're not sure. You hang it at the cafe's impromptu exhibition, heart racing, waiting for that one mysterious patron to sweep in, recognize your genius, and change your fortunes. Instead, an elderly woman admires your use of beige and offers you a withered onion. You take it, because you have no pride left, and you're running out of soup ingredients. The worst part is how the cycle feeds itself. The poorer you get, the more you lean into the myth, the starving artist, suffering for their work, subsisting on scraps, inspiration, and questionable substances. You convince yourself, and everyone else, that adversity sharpens your creativity. Your friends agree, partly out of solidarity, and partly because you're all in the same leaky boat. You toast to tragedy, clinking chipped mugs of absinthe in a celebration of collective misfortune. Rupert, ever the optimist, insists that poverty is character building. He launches ambitious art projects, sculptures made from empty bottles, landscapes painted on discarded wallpaper, and hosts salons in his freezing room, charging admission in the form of bread, cheese, or a new anecdote. There's always an air of optimism, of maybe tomorrow a critic will visit the cafe, maybe tomorrow a noble will mistake your sketch for genius and commission a mural, maybe tomorrow the price of onions will finally drop. Meanwhile, everyday life remains a balancing act. You pawn your winter coat for rent money, then borrow Violet's cape for warmth. You develop a sixth sense for which bakeries are generous with samples and which butchers are easily distracted. The threat of eviction looms, but so does the hope that something, anything, will finally tip the scales in your favor. And yet, somehow, the creativity persists. In the shadow of unpaid bills and the glow of gas lamps, masterpieces are born. Hunger sharpens your vision. Cold makes your brushstroke more urgent. The gnawing anxiety of survival translates into music, painting, prose, art that pulses with life, pain, and an unbreakable stubbornness. In the end, being a broke genius is less about romantic suffering and more about relentless, ridiculous perseverance. You create, you endure, you hope, and on the worst days, when absinthe is all that stands between you and despair, you remember that the only thing more stubborn than your creditors is your own faith that one day all this struggle will mean something, maybe even enough for 2 onions. Or, dare to dream, a whole loaf of bread. Absinthe is prescribed for everything from nerves to boredom. Doctors argue whether it's a cure or a curse. You stop caring, mostly because you've forgotten where you put your prescription. Victorian London loves nothing more than a medical mystery, unless it's a medical miracle. And for a shining, deeply confusing moment in the 1890s, absinthe is both. You could walk into almost any chemist's shop, list your symptoms, anxiety, headaches, general creative malaise, existential horror, and walk out with a bottle of bright green medicine. The pharmacist will nod knowingly and warn you not to exceed 2 glasses before breakfast, then wink, as if to say, "But if you do, at least you'll be interesting at parties." Absinthe's official medical uses are as varied as the artists who swear by it. Have a toothache? Absinthe. Trouble sleeping? Absinthe. Uninspired by your own poetry? You guessed it. The newspapers run glowing testimonials from everyone except people with working livers. Saved my marriage, claims one letter. Saved my play, says another. Saved me from ever having to face sobriety, admits one anonymous writer, whose spelling grows progressively worse over the course of his review. The doctors, for their part, can't make up their minds. Half are convinced absinthe is a wonder drug, a magical blend of wormwood, anise, and enough alcohol to silence even the noisiest internal monologue. The other half believe it's a shortcut to madness, poverty, and a premature appointment with Street Peter. Public lectures are held in rented halls, where mustachioed men in waistcoats debate the dangers of the green curse. The crowd is split. Some nod along, others sneak out to the nearest bar for research. Myth, meanwhile, runs wild. Absinthe is said to be the favorite drink of geniuses and lunatics alike. Word spreads that it contains secret ingredients known only to monks, or that it opens the mind to pet visions and the body to reckless adventure. Some say it will help you see colours in the fog. Others insist it's responsible for the fog in the first place. Stories circulate of poets who, after a glass too many, wrote verse so beautiful that birds fell silent, or so dreadful that birds flew into windows to escape. You, naturally, have tried it all. You were given absinthe for your nerves during a particularly bad stretch of winter, only to discover it also relieved you of your last 2 shillings and your fear of public speaking. Once, a doctor prescribed it as a digestive aid, and you spent an evening simultaneously painting, philosophizing, and negotiating with your own stomach. Another time, a friend insisted that the secret to overcoming heartbreak was 1 absinthe, 1 walk around the park, and 1 good cry. It worked. At least until you realized you'd left your shoes and your dignity by the bandstand. There's also the matter of self-destruction, which has become a sort of competitive sport among London's creative class. Everyone claims to have the best recipe for healthful absinthe. Some add sugar, some use spring water, others swear by a sprig of mint or a twist of orange peel. No one mentions that the real side effect is a growing indifference to all things practical. Rent is late? Must be the wormwood. Can't finish your latest novel? Clearly a sign you need another dose. But the truth is, absinthe's power isn't medical or mystical, it's communal. It gives you something to talk about, an excuse to gather, to drink, to debate, to commiserate. In a city where loneliness creeps in with the fog, absinthe is less about healing and more about surviving. Maybe you'll never cure your boredom or your heartbreak, but you'll at least have a story to tell the next time someone asks why you keep misplacing your prescription. So, you raise a glass, doctor's orders or not, and toast to myth, medicine, and the fine art of muddling through. In the end, whether it's a cure or a curse, absinthe is the thing that keeps you going, if only so you can argue about it all over again tomorrow. Morning arrives with a vengeance. Your head pounds, your mouth is dry, and someone appears to have swapped your tongue for a small rug. The only cure? More absinthe? Or possibly exile? In 1890s London, waking up after a night of absinthe is less good morning and more what have I done? You open your eyes and immediately regret it. The sunlight filtering through the smudged window feels personal, aggressive even. Every sound is magnified. The clatter of the neighbour's breakfast, the bell of a distant tram, the fluttering despair of your own heart as you try to recall what, exactly, you promised to paint last night. Your pillow is missing, replaced by a paint-stained sketchbook, and your socks are not on your feet but appear to be doubling as makeshift curtains. Your breath is a blend of licorice and regret. Somewhere, a pigeon laughs. The first stage of the Victorian hangover is denial. It wasn't that much, you tell yourself, conveniently forgetting that the empty bottles forming a small city on your floor suggest otherwise. You stagger to the basin, splash water on your face, and stare at your reflection. Your eyes look like you've just survived a duel with a gas lamp. Your hair has taken on an avant-garde quality, sticking out at improbable angles, defying both gravity and social decency. Next comes the bargaining. If you could just find a cup of tea, a scrap of bread, or even a lukewarm potato, maybe you'd survive the day. Some artists swear by the hair of the dog method. Another glass of absinthe, preferably with a splash of coffee or a dash of optimism. Others crawl into bed and refuse to emerge until evening, convinced that the only true cure is hibernation and self-pity. You consider both options, finally compromising with a half-hearted attempt at breakfast, a crust of bread, a sip of yesterday's tea, and an internal vow never to drink again. A vow that lasts until precisely 6 p.m. If you're lucky, your friends drop by to commiserate. The morning after is practically a social event in bohemian circles. Poets shuffle in, eyes bleary, offering anecdotes about last night's debates and apologies for whatever may have happened to your umbrella. Painters compare hangover sketches, trembling lines, blurred shapes, abstract depictions of existential dread. Someone brings biscuits, another brings news from the cafe, and everyone agrees that absinthe is both the devil's invention and the only reason they made it through another week. As the hours drag on, the second stage hits. Reflection. You remember fragments of conversation. Something about the meaning of art. Something else about trousers as hats. You recall a promise to submit your latest work to an exhibition, and a faint but persistent suspicion that you may have insulted a critic, a landlord, or possibly a small dog. The memory of last night arrives in disjointed pieces. Toasts, laughter, tears, and the sound of someone attempting to recite poetry while standing on a wobbly chair. You check your pockets for evidence. All you find is a green-stained napkin and a note that reads, "Paint the fog, not the trees." By midday, the worst of it fades, replaced by a familiar, almost comforting exhaustion. You shuffle to your easel, determined to create something meaningful out of the chaos. The hangover lingers in every brushstroke, a reminder of both your artistic ambition and your questionable life choices. In the grand tradition of the Victorians, you suffer nobly and milk every bit of agony for artistic inspiration. Maybe today's work will be brilliant. Maybe it will just be green on green. Number 3. Either way, you'll sign it with pride, or at least with a steady enough hand. There's a strange camaraderie in all of this. Everyone suffers together, and somehow that makes it bearable. The hangover becomes a badge of honor, proof that you were there, that you lived through another night of creative excess, and lived to tell the tale. So you pour another cup of tea, raise your battered mug in salute to the artists, the poets, and the painters who keep the city interesting, and promise once again to go easy tonight. Of course you won't, but that's tomorrow's problem. You invent new ways to paint, by candlelight, by memory, by accident. Some of your best work happens when you mistake the cat for a brush. The critics are confused, but that's how you know you're on the right track. Being a London artist in the 1890s means one thing above all: improvisation. The rent's overdue. Your brushes are missing, possibly chewed by the mice, and the only light comes from a candle that flickers like your self-esteem. Necessity is the mother of invention, and in your case, it's also the mother of some truly questionable artistic methods. Let's start with the basics. The days of painting in golden natural light are over the moment you move into your windowless garret. By candlelight, every color shifts a shade or two to the left. Blue becomes mystery, yellow becomes regret, and green, well, green is everywhere, thanks to absinthe, bad paint, and whatever's growing in that forgotten teacup. You squint at your canvas, dab on a little color, and hope for the best. If anyone asks, you call it moody realism. In reality, it's what happens when the power bill is an afterthought. Painting by memory is another bohemian specialty. Your model is late, or perhaps they've simply eloped with your only good hat. So you paint what you recall. Was their nose really that big? Did they have 3 chins, or did you just add those after your second glass of wormwood inspiration? No matter. The end result is an impression of the sitter, which conveniently excuses every anatomical error. You invent entire schools of painting around these mishaps. Half-remembered, realism, absent-minded expressionism, oopsism. Critics say your portraits are full of character. You know it's just because you're bad at ears. Of course, accidents are the soul of innovation. Every spilled drink, every sneeze mid-brushstroke, every cat crossing the canvas at the wrong moment creates something new. Last week, a spilled drop of absinthe made a perfect green halo around Violet's face, instantly turning a boring portrait into a symbolist masterpiece. You tell everyone it's a metaphor for the intoxication of creativity, and at least 2 art students write their dissertations on it. Never mind that the original idea was just to get the painting done before the landlord turned off the gas. You experiment with tools too. When the brushes finally give up, you switch to spoons, forks, or the bristles from a disintegrating broom. At one point, you try using the tail of a particularly patient mouse. He's now part of your collaborative period. Sometimes you even paint with your fingers, the hem of your coat, or a carefully folded page from a letter you never meant to send. Every new tool becomes a talking point, and you find yourself explaining at length the symbolic resonance of working with objects from everyday life, when really, you just can't afford a new set of brushes. Absinthe itself, of course, deserves credit for a few breakthroughs. After 3 glasses, you become convinced that perspective is an outdated conspiracy, and that every painting needs at least one floating object. Gravity, after all, is just another rule waiting to be broken. You start layering paint so thickly that your still lifes become 3-dimensional. One visitor calls your work sculpture, another calls it disturbing, and your neighbor just asks if you're using his boot for reference. There's a joy in the madness. Sometimes, your technique is just whatever gets the painting finished before dawn, or before you lose interest and move on to a new idea. You're never quite sure what you'll produce. Sometimes brilliance, sometimes a disaster so magnificent it circles all the way back to interesting. The point is, you keep working, keep inventing, and keep confusing the critics. And if the cat comes away with a green tail, well, that's just another sign you're living the bohemian dream. In a world that expects art to be tidy, careful, and planned, your greatest technique is making it up as you go along. Because sometimes the best work really does come from a poor decision, a happy accident, or a bold leap into the unknown, paint, cat hair, and all. Eventually, the authorities step in. Absinthe is blamed for everything from public nudity to poetry slams. They ban it. Artists switch to gin, which just makes the paintings uglier. No one really remembers the exact day Absinthe was officially exiled from London's cafes and cluttered studios, but everyone remembers the panic. The Green Fairy, once the not-so-secret source of artistic ambition, suddenly became a scapegoat for all of society's ills. The tabloids ran headlines like, "Absinthe Menace?" or "Muse?" and "Is your neighbour's creativity contagious?" Church sermons thundered warnings about the perils of green-tinted madness. And members of Parliament, some of whom had only just sobered up from their own absinthe binges, began loudly demanding moral order. For a while, it seemed as if anything remotely unusual could be pinned on absinthe. Did your neighbour's laundry come back pink? Absinthe. Did someone try to serenade a pigeon in Piccadilly Circus at midnight? Clearly absinthe. Was there a particularly confusing abstract sculpture unveiled at the Arts Salon? not talent, not vision, absinthe. The more artists protested, the more convinced the authorities became that a ban was the only way to protect London's fragile, highly imaginative social fabric. When the decree finally came down, it was met with predictable outrage and melodrama. Cafe owners staged mock funerals, complete with empty green bottles lined up like mourners. Poets took to the streets, reciting sonnets in protest, only to be ignored by passers-by more interested in a half-price bread stall. Painters organised a Last Supper at Violet's garret, featuring an all-green menu, lettuce sandwiches, lime jelly, and a very alarming cake. It was, by general consensus, completely inedible. With absinthe gone, the search for substitutes began. Artists, ever resourceful, experimented with everything from gin to cheap sherry, herbal teas to dubious tinctures, brewed by Rupert's friend who claimed to have a background in chemistry. The results were, at best, disappointing. Gin, lacking the romantic hue and herbal bitterness of absinthe, made everyone's paintings look a bit bleaker, a bit wobblier, and somehow always involved at least one unexpected dog. Cheap sherry led to a brief but memorable period of sepia-toned melancholy, during which every poem contained the line, "Alas, the world is brown," but nothing quite filled the void. Gin didn't inspire midnight debates about the soul. Herbal tea failed to unlock visions of floating clocks and green-haired muses. Rupert's homebrew nearly blinded a sculptor and was quietly buried in the backyard. Even Violet's optimistic artisanal mocktails were only good for cleaning brushes. The cafes lost their glow. The conversations lost their edge. Someone tried to stage a poetry slam with lemonade, but the result was so wholesome it was banned for dangerously uplifting the spirits. Artists grieved in their own ways. Some claimed the ban was a challenge, a new era of pure, sober inspiration. Others sank deeper into nostalgia, toasting the good old green days and reminiscing about paint-stained parties that blurred into sunrise. A few opportunists tried to market absinthe essence, a suspicious syrup that tasted like cough drops and left a peculiar tingling in the toes. Nobody was fooled, though a few people pretended, just for old times' sake. Of course, a ban never quite stops anything. Absinthe went underground. Secret tastings cropped up in the city's shabbier corners. Password required, knock 3 times, bring your own sugar cube. The green fairy flitted on, just out of sight, inspiring a new generation of artists to paint, write, and dream beneath the radar. There were even rumors that Oscar Wilde himself had acquired a secret stash and would occasionally invite friends over for theatre, tea, and a taste of the forbidden. But the era had changed. Without absinthe, the art lost a certain reckless edge. London grew a bit more sensible, a bit less green, yet the memory lingered. A bittersweet aftertaste of rebellion, innovation, and glorious mischief. You could take the absinthe out of the artist, but you could never quite take the artist out of the absinthe. And so you switch to gin, mutter about the old days, and try to find inspiration in the bottom of a teacup. It's never quite the same, but you keep painting. After all, the real magic was never in the drink. It was in the glorious chaos that came with it. Did absinthe cause wild visions? Or was that just the cheese? Some swear they saw angels, others saw the bill collector. The line between hallucination and imagination was always a bit blurry. If you ask any Victorian artist about their wildest absinthe tale, you'll get stories that sound like a blend of supernatural encounter, fever dream, and bad dietary decisions. For decades, London's creative class swore that the Green Fairy wasn't just a poetic nickname, but a genuine entity, an emerald-hued sprite who flitted just out of sight, whispering lines of verse and the occasional recipe for disaster. The public, meanwhile, soaked up the rumors. The tabloids breathlessly reported on artists who claimed to have painted entire canvases under the guidance of ghostly hands, or found themselves locked in mortal combat with a teapot that suddenly turned sinister. But what was actually happening behind those fogged-up windows? Let's break it down. Absinthe, for all its mystique, is essentially high-proof alcohol spiked with enough herbal flavor to make you question your taste in beverages. The infamous wormwood contains a compound called thujone, long blamed for triggering hallucinations and artistic genius in equal measure. Early scientists claimed it acted on the mind like a muse with boundary issues, opening the doors of perception and then refusing to leave. In reality, most modern experts agree that the legendary hallucinations probably had more to do with quantity than chemistry. Victorian artists weren't exactly known for moderation. An evening's work could involve several glasses of absinthe, a few tumblers of gin, and a snack that looked suspiciously like old cheese left out on the windowsill. Add to that chronic sleep deprivation, malnutrition, and the stress of knowing your next meal depended on whether anyone liked your latest painting of woman with two shadows and an octopus, and it's no wonder the wallpaper started looking chatty. Still, the stories persist. Some claim they saw visions of beauty, flashes of inspiration, a sudden understanding of the universe, or colors that no paint could capture. A poet named Augustus once insisted he glimpsed the face of Aphrodite in his tea, then spent a week trying to convince everyone that his cup had mystical properties. It did not. It had a crack. Others were less fortunate. One sculptor described being haunted by the relentless gaze of an owl-shaped inkwell. A playwright spent an entire evening convinced the neighbor's baby was secretly Charles Dickens in disguise. Sometimes these tales became part of artistic lore, passed around smoky cafes and retold, until even the teller couldn't remember where truth ended and embroidery began. Of course, not all hallucinations were so romantic. For every vision of celestial beauty, there was another of creeping dread. The prior, green fairy might appear, but so did the green landlord, demanding overdue rent with supernatural persistence. More than one artist confessed to seeing their paintings move, or, worse, criticize their technique. You'd swear the muse in your self-portrait winked at you, or the street lamp outside blinked in Morse code. Was it genius, or just the cumulative effect of exhaustion, stress, and herbal spirits? Hard to say. There's also the power of suggestion. When everyone around you is convinced that absinthe opens portals to the other world, your brain becomes a stage for the weird and wonderful. After a late night at the cabaret, it's easy to start believing that shadows are watching, that the fog is swirling on purpose, that the green fairy might just be hiding behind the bread box. If your friends see visions, who are you to admit all you see is your reflection, looking a bit greener than usual? Yet, in the heart of it all, lies a quiet truth. Artists, especially those underfed and overcaffeinated, have always flirted with the line between perception and imagination. Absinthe simply gave them permission to wander further afield, to claim every flash of oddity as a brush with the divine, a visit from the muse, or, at the very least, an excellent excuse for being late on their deadlines. So, did absinthe really cause hallucinations? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. And sometimes it just helped artists see what they needed to see. In a world desperate for beauty, rebellion, and a little bit of magic, that green glass vision, whether real or imagined, was sometimes all it took to get through the night, or at the very least, to justify one more glass. Your studio smells like a mix of paint thinner, licorice, and existential dread. Some say the scent of absinthe is the smell of genius. Others say it's the reason the landlord stopped coming upstairs. If you've ever wondered what it's like to step inside the creative epicenter of an 1890s London, artist, It's best to start with the nose. The moment you open your studio door, you're hit with an aroma that's part apothecary, part bakery, and part what died in the corner. Absinthe, with its heady bouquet of herbs and its sharp, almost medicinal tang, is the reigning fragrance, cutting through the staleness like a green-tinted thunderbolt. It clings to every surface: canvas, clothing, the pages of half-written poems, and, in particularly bohemian households, the occasional mouse. The scent itself is a complex character. At first, there's the unmistakable black licorice punch of anise, a scent that lingers on your hands and breath, prompting strangers to wonder if you've taken up a second job as a confectioner. Beneath that, the bitter sharpness of wormwood drifts up, floral and unsettling. Mix in a dash of fennel and whatever herbs the distiller found growing behind the shop, and you've got a potion that smells as strong as it tastes. Add the tang of turpentine, the oil of linseed, and the sweet, slow rot of week-old baguette, and you get something uniquely Victorian, the perfume of effort, ambition, and a faint whiff of despair. For the creative mind, these smells become oddly reassuring. The presence of absinthe, its vapor hanging just above the chaos, signals that you're still part of the game. Your studio is less an orderly workspace and more a sensory arena. Every new painting, every new stanza, emerges from a fog of aromas both uplifting and suspicious. Inspiration, you tell yourself, lives in the air. So does a worrying amount of dust. Not everyone is enchanted by this olfactory onslaught. Your friends arrive and wrinkle their noses. Poets cough theatrically and claim they can taste the absinthe in the very atmosphere. Your neighbor from 2 doors down has been known to light suspiciously large candles in the hall when you host a salon. And the landlord, who once came up to collect rent and left pale and silent, hasn't returned since. The scent of genius, it seems, has protective properties. It wards off bill collectors and the faint of heart in equal measure. But if the smell is a warning for outsiders, it's also a banner for insiders. In the cafes of Soho, artists wear the scent of absinthe like a badge of honor. You can spot your own kind by the way they linger at the bar, inhaling deeply, claiming they're chasing inspiration while actually just hoping someone else will buy the next round. The air is thick with stories and possibilities, all of them lightly seasoned with licorice and old paint. The association runs deeper than habit. It's mythic. Artists convince themselves, and each other, that the aroma of absinthe is inherently creative. It tickles the mind, stirs the senses, and gives the mundane a little edge of magic. In quieter moments, you catch yourself believing it too. Maybe this is what genius smells like, a cocktail of defiance and hope, seasoned with the conviction that your next work might actually matter. Still, sometimes you wonder, does genius really come on the wings of wormwood and anise? Or is it just easier to believe when your nose is too confused to object? You experiment with open windows, incense, and the occasional airing out of your best coat, but always return to the familiar haze. It's the smell of your life, messy, determined, unmistakably you. So, the next time you pass a room that smells like a cross between a herb garden and a paint factory, take heart. Somewhere in the fog, an artist is at work, their senses tuned to the peculiar music of London, and their dreams buoyed on a cloud of licorice-scented inspiration. And if the landlord's footsteps are nowhere to be heard, well, consider that proof you're doing something right. The green fairy is a French invention, but Londoners make it their own, with more rain, less hygiene, and slightly more dramatic poetry readings. It's international bohemianism with a British accent. Absinthe, as every aspiring poet is quick to remind you, began its life in the sun-dappled hillsides of Switzerland and blossomed in the bustling cafes of Paris. In France, it was an artist's talisman, a muse poured into a glass. As essential to the Belle Époque as top hats and scandalous can-can dancers. It arrived in London with the promise of transforming mere mortals into visionaries and turning dreary evenings into raucous salons. Naturally, the English saw this as both a challenge and an opportunity to outdo the French in melodrama, if not in mustaches. How did Absinthe make the leap across the channel? It started innocently enough. Bottles smuggled in by travellers, tales swapped in the back rooms of literary societies, artists returning from Paris with a newfound taste for herbal intoxication and a suspiciously flamboyant scarf. The first sightings were in high society. London's elite, eager to stay ahead of continental trends, hosted fashionable absinthe parties, complete with imported spoons and elaborate water fountains. Guests marveled at the ritual. Sugar cubes balanced on silver, green liquid turning cloudy as water dripped through, a theatrical flourish that masked the drink's bite. But as always, the Bohemians got hold of it, and things quickly spiraled out of control. What began as an exotic tipple for the upper crust soon became the fuel of choice for struggling artists and playwrights. Parisian cafes might have offered a dash of decadence, but London's version came with soggy scarves, endless drizzle, and a steadfast refusal to ever properly clean the glassware. The glamour faded, replaced by the grimy reality of Soho's cramped studios and backstreet bars, where absinthe was consumed with a mixture of awe and mild terror. Londoners, never content to simply copy, gave the Green Fairy their own peculiar spin. Parisian absinthe drinkers discussed philosophy and flirted over croissants. In London, the conversation turned to weather, rent, and whether the cheese in the corner was a still life or a health hazard. The rituals stayed, pour, drip, stare into the glass and hope for inspiration. But the setting changed. The clatter of hooves outside, the persistent dampness, and the ever-present aroma of coal smoke gave everything a distinctly British hue. The drink itself adapted too. British distillers, never ones to let the French have the last word, began brewing their own absinthe, sometimes herbal and delicate, sometimes powerful enough to strip the paint off the studio door. Recipes were swapped in whispered tones. Was wormwood truly necessary? Or was that just continental nonsense? Could you add a spot of gin for courage? Should you use rainwater for authenticity, or just to save money on the gas bill? Nobody agreed, and that, of course, became part of the charm. Absinthe's journey from Paris to London brought a whole new flavour of bohemian culture with it. The French gave it style. The British gave it stubbornness. Every poet with a grudge against the weather saw in absinthe a kindred spirit, intense, a little bitter, a touch unpredictable. The Green Fairy inspired a new generation of Londoners to paint with reckless abandon, recite poems to strangers, and generally lower the neighbourhood's property values. Cafes and cabarets adapted too. London's musicians penned odes to the Green Fairy, while actors took their bows to the tune of clinking glasses and the occasional fainting audience member. The drink's mystique spread through every layer of society. The upper class who claimed it for fashion, the working class who claimed it for rebellion, and the artists who just wanted an excuse for eccentricity. Through it all, absinthe never quite lost its French soul, but in London it picked up a Cockney swagger, a taste for melancholy drizzle, and a talent for inspiring great art in the unlikeliest of places. By the turn of the century, the Green Fairy belonged as much to London as to Paris, a symbol of creative chaos, communal suffering, and the strange, shared hope that genius might be lurking at the bottom of just one more glass. For a brief moment, absinthe is the it drink. If you can't afford a patron, you drink one. The more you drink, the more authentic your art becomes. At least, according to other broke artists. This is bohemian economics at its finest. In Paris, real artists have wealthy benefactors. Silk-robed widows, eccentric dukes, or bored industrialists eager to sponsor a masterpiece or two. In London, you have Absinthe. It's cheap enough to buy, strong enough to forget your financial situation, and glamorous enough to be mistaken for a career move. A few green bottles on the windowsill serve as your credentials. If anyone asks about your patron, you gesture to the nearest glass, raise your eyebrows, and sigh, as if sharing a joke only the truly enlightened would understand. Soon, Absinthe becomes more than a beverage. It's a badge of belonging, an edible resume for the artistically ambitious but perennially underfunded. The green fairy glows in every cafe window, the drink of poets, painters, playwrights, and anyone else who wants to appear too troubled to worry about things like income or nutrition. Your friends call it liquid inspiration. Your landlord calls it evidence for eviction. Either way, you can't afford to not be seen with it. At the cafe, there's a subtle hierarchy. The more green your glass, the more people take you seriously, especially if you look slightly haunted and your conversation drifts toward the existential. You learn to perform the ritual with flair, discussing wormwood as if it's a distant cousin, and waxing poetic about the green hour when creativity arrives, or at least when you stop noticing you're cold and hungry. Young artists imitate the famous ones, swirling sugar over their glasses and quoting Wilde until the last tram leaves for Paddington. Of course, the romance of Absinthe is contagious. The more inaccessible real patrons become, the more everyone romanticizes the green fairy as a loyal companion and the ultimate mark of artistic integrity. In reality, most people just want to feel like part of the club. If you're spotted with a mug of tea or a cup of water, your reputation drops faster than the rent on a rain-soaked garret. But cradle a cloudy absinthe, and you're suddenly mysterious, tragic, and probably working on a revolutionary new technique involving damp paper and a cat named Baudelaire. Soon, absinthe works its way into your art itself. You paint green-tinted portraits, write poems about emerald rivers, and add at least one cryptic mention of the muse in a glass to your diary every week. Even critics get in on the act, declaring that no true masterpiece can emerge without the subtle sting of wormwood and woe. Galleries host green nights, where every artist is required to drink absinthe and discuss the meaning of meaninglessness. Half the paintings are sideways, but no one cares. It's the experience that counts. Naturally, there's backlash. Some older artists roll their eyes and claim the whole thing is a fad. In my day, grumbles one landscape painter, we painted with mud and drank water, and that was enough. His protest falls on deaf ears. Mostly because everyone else is busy debating whether adding a sprig of mint to the glass counts as selling out. Meanwhile, the market for absinthe-inspired trinkets explodes. Green scarves, absinthe-flavored lozenges, spoons engraved with dubious quotations. You're not sure if you're part of a movement or just caught up in a very elaborate marketing campaign. Still, for a short, shining window, absinthe levels the playing field. It's the poor man's patron, the drink that says, I may be broke, but I'm not unimaginative. And for every artist who spends a fortune on brushes and canvas, there are 3 more pouring their hopes, their heartbreaks, and their last shilling into a glass of the green stuff. In a city where genius is measured in suffering and style, absinthe is both a ticket to the party and a way of making sure no one ever forgets you were there, even if you sometimes forget yourself. So you raise a glass, toast your fellow paupers, and keep painting. Because in the world of the struggling artist, a patron is nice, but an empty absinthe bottle is proof you truly tried. When the fog clears and the bans go into effect, London's artists are left with stories, scandals, and an impressive collection of empty bottles. Did absinthe really change art, or just give it a hangover? Maybe both. It's the early 20th century, and the age of the green fairy has officially ended. Not with a bang, but with a hangover. a new generation of teetotaling poets, and the lingering scent of licorice in every creaky studio in Soho. The Bohemians and their legendary nights become the stuff of folklore, recounted over cups of tea, and the occasional nostalgic sip of contraband absinthe. Critics debate whether the drink was the true muse behind a decade of feverish creativity, or just an excuse for terrible decisions and even worse financial planning. For many artists, the end of absinthe marks the end of an era, a time when anything felt possible, and every night was an experiment in how much inspiration could fit into a single paint-splattered room. Absinthe is immortalized in paintings, journals, and the kind of poetry that makes future generations wonder if Green Hour was a metaphor or just a really long, blurry evening. Your own memories become museum pieces. The sugar-stained spoons, the half-finished canvases, the love letters written on napkins and stained with rings of emerald. Each bottle on the shelf is a little trophy, a souvenir from a war fought with words, pigment, and stubborn, sleepless hope. But what did absinthe actually do for art? The honest answer is a bit of everything. It encouraged boldness, a willingness to blur the boundaries between genius and nonsense. The Green Fairy turned ordinary evenings into unpredictable adventures. Artists painted with wilder colours and wrote with fewer inhibitions, convinced that if the fairies were real, then surely the rules could be broken too. For a brief, shining moment, even failure felt romantic. Of course, absinthe's real legacy isn't just in the art left behind, but in the culture it created. The cafes of Soho became laboratories of the absurd, places where painters, poets, musicians, and would-be philosophers mixed, argued, and occasionally started indoor bonfires. The rituals around absinthe, the drip, the louche, the glass raised in a midnight toast, turned drinking into a ceremony of camaraderie. Everyone was equal in the fog, the broke and the famous, the bold and the bashful. Friendships were forged over glasses of green, and heartbreaks were healed, or at least drowned, in the same. Not all memories are gilded, though. For every story of genius, there's another of spectacular self-destruction. The hangovers lingered longer than the inspiration. Some lost themselves in the fog and never quite found their way back out. When the bands came, it wasn't just a loss of a drink, but the loss of an excuse, a reason to gather, to dream, to risk a little more for the sake of art. Yet, as the years passed, the legend of the Green Fairy only grew. Painters immortalized her in swirling brushstrokes. Writers spun tales of the last absinthe night, exaggerating for effect, and because, in truth, most of the details were a bit fuzzy anyway. Absinthe became a symbol of rebellion, of hope, of the urge to live and create, a little bit wildly. Even as London modernized and the teacups outnumbered the tumblers, you'd still find, in some back alley, a whispered memory of those wild green years. In the end, absinthe's legacy is as complicated as any bohemian, equal parts tragedy and triumph, cautionary tale and celebration. It didn't create genius, but it certainly invited it to the party, and sometimes that's all history remembers. So you dust off a bottle, raise a glass to what was, and remind yourself that, for better or worse, you once lived in a world where art and chaos danced together in a haze of green. And that, if nothing else, is a legacy worth toasting, preferably with tea, but always with just a hint of mischief. It's the 20th century. The absinthe is gone. Some artists retire to tea and seltzer. Others claim they still see green fairies, usually around tax season. London moves on, but the legend lingers, tinged with both nostalgia and nausea. Absinthe, once the symbol of daring bohemian nights, is now just another banned substance, a ghost in a green bottle. The artists of London are left to pick up the pieces of their livers and reputations, swapping scandalous drinks for milder comforts. Suddenly, you're expected to find inspiration in a pot of Earl Grey and a dash of seltzer, rather than in the herbal mysteries of wormwood and anise. You sit at the same table where you once held forth about the future of art and the metaphysics of breakfast. But now the only spirit present is the faint whiff of cleaning alcohol. For some, the transition is easy. Tea, after all, is a ritual in its own right, measured, civilized, unlikely to end with someone trying to paint the cat or recite Hamlet at the coal scuttle. There's something comforting about a steaming cup, about sugar cubes that stay in the cup and not balanced precariously on ornate spoons. A generation of artists learns to appreciate the subtle pleasures of sobriety. Remembering what you painted the night before, waking up with both socks, and, miracle of miracles, getting through an entire morning without apologizing to the furniture. Others, though, are less convinced. Every so often, you catch an old painter gazing wistfully at an empty windowsill, missing the green glow and the wild promise of a night with the fairy. Some claim that sobriety has sharpened their vision, while others confess that life seems a bit duller, the colours less vivid. A few of the truly devoted insist that, if you squint just right, you can still see the faint outline of a fairy hovering above the teapot, especially when the taxman comes calling. The cafes, too, have changed. Where once the air was thick with the licorice scent of absinthe and the sharp tang of creative panic, now it's just coffee, cigarettes, and a lingering sense that something's missing. The poetry readings continue, but with fewer existential crises and more talk of publishing contracts. The painters argue about modernism and cubism, instead of arguing about who spilled what on whose best waistcoat. There's a sense that things are safer, quieter, and maybe, just maybe, a little bit less fun. And yet, the legend won't die. The new generation, raised on cautionary tales of wild green nights, is both fascinated and wary. Rumours persist of secret bottles stashed in back rooms, of old-timers who'll share a taste if you know the right password. Students gossip about the glory days, debating whether the madness was worth the masterpieces. Every art class has that one kid who swears his great-uncle once drank absinthe with Oscar Wilde and never recovered. The green fairy becomes a kind of artistic ancestor. Beloved, infamous, and always just out of reach. With time, the stories grow taller. That one painting, surely it was inspired by visions? That peculiar poem about green light and dancing shadows? Must have been absinthe. Absinthe becomes a myth and a warning, a shorthand for wild ambition and necessary restraint. Don't drink the green stuff, says the teacher, unless you're ready to write your regrets in iambic pentameter. Ultimately, the city adapts, as cities always do. Life moves forward. The artists keep painting, keep writing, keep arguing about the true source of genius. Some embrace tea, others toast with seltzer. A few sneak a taste of the forbidden on especially gloomy afternoons. But the memory remains, a bittersweet souvenir of a time when anything seemed possible, when genius and disaster danced together in the foggy streets of London. And so, with a final, rueful smile, you put away the absinthe spoon, brew another